Welcome to the 128th season of the Canadian Club Toronto, Canada's Podium. For over a century, this platform has been a gathering place for visionaries, public figures, and decision makers to discuss the most pressing issues of our time.
We've been having important discussions and debates around this podium in this country for well over a century. I call this a historic podium of record.
Our club's always been a forum for visionaries, public figures, and decision makers to command attention to the issues of our time.
The Canadian Club is one of the most important podiums anywhere in the world that a Canadian can speak to, tell Canadians what it is that they think, develop those thoughts. And so I want to thank you for that very, very much.
Please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists today.
Through our programs and events, including our youth and young leaders programs, our diversity partnerships, our joint events, and our media and social media opportunities, we offer you access to dynamic political, social, and business figures from abroad and right here at home.
The platform from which the eloquence of Canada has flowed all of that time, whether it be business, education, politics, sports, arts and culture. If someone wants to say something to Canadians about this country and about the future of this country, this is the venue you choose.
Good afternoon, members and guests. Thank you for joining us. My name is Tanya Van Biesen, President of Canadian Club Toronto and your host. I would also like to welcome those who have joined us online. In an era marked by fractured trust and geopolitical shifts, our goal today is to understand precisely how Canada's financial professions can maintain and enhance their strategic advantage. Today, we bring together the leading voices from the Chartered Professional Accountants, the Chartered Financial Analysts, and the Financial Planners of Canada for a timely discussion. Our goal is to explore how, amidst deglobalization and a crowded information landscape, leading with integrity can strengthen trust, drive growth, and solidify Canada's position as a global leader in ethical finance. Our esteemed panelists will delve into the unique opportunities and responsibilities before us, examining how CPAs, CFAs, and financial planners can champion trust, transparency, and competence. From interprovincial harmonization to cross-sector collaboration, this conversation is crucial for building a more resilient, unified financial system and ensuring Canada's continued prosperity. Now, events like this are only possible with our partners and sponsors who help us to deliver these important conversations. And today we're proud to feature 5 leading industry sponsors, including Deloitte, EY, KPMG, PwC, and Sun Life. And I'd just like to say thank you. We appreciate your support. I'd also like to acknowledge Canadian Bankers Association as our season sponsor and Air Canada as our official airline sponsor, and of course Canadian Forest Trust Corporation, who helps us to offset our carbon footprint by planting trees in our honour. We have today among us students from the dais at TMU. We're very glad you're here, and we hope you will have some great questions for the panel. For those who haven't been there before, I encourage you to visit our website at canadianclub.org, where there's great information about upcoming events, but also past events in case you missed them. They are all available on demand. And I do hope, this is meant to be a conversation, so for those who have questions, and I hope there will be many, we have Q&A cards on your table, so please feel free to fill those out, and we will bring those up to the moderator. And for those who are joining us online, please hit the red Q&A button on the right side of your screen when we open the floor for questions. It is now my pleasure to introduce our panel. Tashia Batstone, President and CEO, FP Canada. Pam Steer, President and CEO, CPA Canada. Michael Thom, Managing Director, CFA Canada. And moderating today's discussion is Rita Trichur, Senior Business Writer and Columnist, The Globe and Mail. Rita and panelists, Canada's podium is yours.
Thank you very much. And this is such an important conversation, and I'm particularly excited that there are students here because they will be the future drivers of change. Let's just start off by talking a bit about how we got here. What are some of the challenges that are facing the industry how did we get to this era of broken trust? What can be done to fix it? Let's just start with opening remarks. Go ahead.
Thank you, Rita. It's great to be here, and it was such a really great audience. Thank you for coming and sponsoring. You know, we have so much information. That information overload today is absolutely overwhelming, and more gets added to the conversation every day. And what we see is because there is so much information that cannot be justified, cannot be proven, cannot be demonstrated as truth, Canada's professions more and more play a very important role in ensuring that consistency and effectiveness of trust, because what often gets forgotten at the end of the day is that trust is what underlies the Canadian and the world's financial ecosystem. You know, when you think about our currency, it's a fiat currency, which means it runs on trust. And if you don't have trust in that financial ecosystem, then capital will stop flowing because investors need to make good decisions. And what do they need for that? They need reliable, consistent, and comparable information.
Okay, Michael.
Yeah, you know, I think it's, I'll say as an opening comment, and I'll note the students here from, you know, fundamentally a policy think tank. And I think that's really interesting to be in the room with a group of financial professionals for the most part. And I'll say, given the economic moment we're in, the political moment we're in, there's a lot of conversation and engagement happening by the political class and the policy class with the investor class, which I think we sort of identify as. And there's a lot you can do with that, because I think that's been a door that hasn't been as open for some time. And I think there's an incredible amount that we can do in building Canada with that, because ultimately we are sort of the allocators of capital, the collectors of capital that are going to put money to work. And so I'm just really energized by that. I'm really excited by that. I think from a trust perspective, you see what happens, I think, in the cold light of day after a crisis has passed, where, you know, folks can be opportunistic, where you know, you think about the COVID crisis and things that happened around procurement and things that happened around sourcing that, like, oh gosh, we've all collectively overpaid and underdelivered. And what does that do to trust in the people providing that? What does that do to trust in government? What does that do to trust, sort of societal trust in institutions? And I think it's incumbent upon us to seek those opportunities to deliver at a higher level, to sort of take the orientation of, I'm not here sort of for myself. I'm not here sort of for my firm. I'm here for the client, and you know, the economics will follow in a sort of fair way. But you know, I think we all have a natural sort of professional deterrent to rent seeking as a behavior, and I think that becomes really, really important in these moments of national crisis, economic war, however you want to sort of intone it. And so I'm excited by the engagement. I'm excited by you know, the opportunity that presents, but I also think we need to live up to that promise in sort of the greatest way possible to sort of chart the path forward.
Tashia, I want to bring you into the conversation. What is your view on trust?
You know, I'll just take it sort of from the consumer's perspective. What I see is that consumers, you know, Pamela, you mentioned just tremendous amounts of information. And the average consumer is out there just trying to deal with that complexity in the environment and the volatility. And who can they turn to? Who can they talk to get that trusted advice? And Mike, to your point, sometimes even the people that they turn to don't necessarily act in their best interest. And so I think it becomes so important in today's environment to be able to provide that trust. We've done research at FP Canada that shows that, you know, trust indexes are frighteningly low for Canadians. And then when you get into more diversity and you get into more, you know, dealing with underrepresented communities, it's worse. And so, you know, collectively, I think we have a responsibility to try to help consumers manage, work through, deal with that volatility, and do it in a way such that their interests are put first, such that, you know, the people providing that advice and that trust have the right skills, the right competencies to be doing the job and are overseen appropriately, because somehow we've got to build back that message. And the way I view today is we're at a bit of a pivotal time, right? You know, these are the first time that I've, you know, in many, many years that I have seen such a commitment across the country towards trying to build more clarity for consumers, more trust for consumers, to allow professionals to work in environments, across the country and not in silos. And I think that can only enhance the financial, situation that Canadians are facing, and overall the whole Canadian economy. So I'm like you, Mike, I'm optimistic.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit about one of my favorite topics that I write about in my columns, interprovincial trade barriers. I know you guys, people think it's boring, but it's really sexy stuff. And it's a big focus of the government, federally, and the provinces these days. And for his part, Prime Minister Mark Carney has talked about wanting to eliminate federal trade barriers by Canada Day. That's not that long from now. I want to talk to each of you about, how can harmonized professional and regulatory standards across provinces contribute to greater economic resilience? And I'm asking this question because we're already seeing some pushback from certain provinces regarding certain professions. So, Pamela, maybe you can go first.
Well, for sure, and I would say that CPA Canada, one of the amazing things about the accounting profession is that it's not just provincial, it is provincially regulated. That's, all the professions are provincially regulated. However, it is very integrated, not only nationally, but internationally. And when you have that alignment and harmonization to the extent possible, that makes things just a lot more efficient and effective. And when you have professions that are then, those barriers are reduced or eliminated, you can move the labor can move where it's needed most. And we hear this conversation very frequently in the healthcare profession, but I think it applies equally to many others out there, including accounting, where having a harmonized national education program, having a harmonized national examination program, as we do from CPA Canada, is incredibly effective and efficient, because no matter if you are in Yellowknife, in Victoria, or where I was on the weekend in St. John's, Tasha's from St. John's too, right across the country, when you enter the profession, you're all entering at the same bar. So you know what those requirements are, and that ongoing commitment to education and information is incredibly important. So breaking down provincial barriers, why would you want to have to learn and find out the nuances and differences between 12 organizations? That's a lot of reading and understanding. That just gets confusing. Having simplified and efficient rules and regulations across the country, we're one economy, we're only 2% of global GDP. It makes sense that we should act as one economy, and I love that, what we're seeing, both from the provincial aspect as well as from the federals.
Yeah, I mean, preach. Look, we're coming at this from the perspective of, not just a nationally harmonized profession, but actually a globally harmonized profession. And I think, I was discussing with some of my table mates, I would love to say that's by design, but I think it's just by circumstance, in that I think our program developed in the 1960s and 70s primarily in this time when capital was global implicitly, investing was global implicitly, and I think you work backwards from that and you say, how do we end up with anything else from an efficiency of outcomes perspective? And I don't know that we do. I mean, we're very proud of the fact that we're a global passport. I'm very proud that I know people that have started their CFA exam journey in Sao Paulo or Lagos or Beijing, and have written an exam or come to Canada, and it's literally like you renew the same way that you did last year. You just maybe join a local society if you'd like, and that's the only difference. There's no gatekeeping. There's no sort of parochial barriers, and it shouldn't be that novel. When we were running a file with Immigration Canada, one of the senior bureaucrats was sort of commenting that this is like completely novel. Like there's nothing, like there's no fee, there's no hoop, there's no, and you sort of say, well, from an efficiency of outcome perspective, of course not. We want mobility of talent. We want the best and brightest in the world to be able to come here and put money to work and make this their home. And so sort of inverting the problem, like I don't know how you start in any other place if you sort of look at what we're trying to accomplish, I think, as a country in this moment. And so I appreciate that others have parochial historical concerns, and that change is painful. I get all of that. But I think if we can keep our eye on the prize with sort of what's the best for Canada in this, and stay energized by that and stay driven,
Tashia, do you have anything to add?
I tie it down to one thing. We talked about trust before. Trust doesn't have provincial boundaries, and standards shouldn't either, at the end of the day. I think it's as simple as that. I think when you look at the financial planning profession, clients move from province to province, from country to country. They have assets. It's not a world where everybody has all their assets in Ontario, all their families in Ontario, everything's in Ontario or everything is in another jurisdiction. People have assets all over the country. They have, family all over the country and all over the world. And so when they're dealing with a financial professional, they don't necessarily want to have a financial planner in Ontario and then have another financial planner in Newfoundland or in BC. They want to be able to deal with one person who knows and understands their financial situation and can help them. And I think that's why when you look at the CFP designation, it is a global designation. Now, in all fairness, we probably don't have the same mobility as the CFAs do because we have a lot of local content, because people need to understand local content. But we're working really hard to create pathways whereby someone who is a CFP in the United States can easily build the skills and knowledge and competences that they need to serve a client in the United States who may have a family member in Canada. And it's the same thing across the provincial barriers and the provincial boundaries as well, because there's all slightly different law, some tax differences. I'll give you a good example. One of the things that we've done recently is in the province of Quebec, financial planning is regulated differently. It is the one province in Canada where you have to hold a specific credential, which is not a CFP. And we've just opened up a reciprocity path between the PL Fins in Quebec and the CFPs in Canada, whereby you can move seamlessly between the two jurisdictions. All we require is that you do a bit of a short course on Quebec law and tax, and somebody coming from Quebec does the same with respect to the rest of Canada. So if you're somebody who's living in Hull, you can serve clients in Ottawa and you can serve clients in Montreal. And that seamlessness is there. And I think that becomes really important as we go forward because, just because of the changing nature of where consumers live, where they invest, where their families are, and how you can make sure you can still provide that holistic advice with a trusted advisor who you're comfortable working with and have worked with for a long time.
Okay, I'm just going to add one thought to this. It's not really based on business, but labor mobility is so important to ensuring sovereignty, particularly in Canada's north. So anything we can do to ensure our sovereignty, particularly at these very interesting geopolitical times, I think would be a benefit. Okay, let's talk about ethical leadership and trust. Just continue to build on that topic. Public interest, obviously, is something that I think a lot about as a journalist. And, unfortunately, we write a lot of stories at the Globe and Mail about people who lack professional integrity. But serving the public interest is foundational to financial leadership, and we've talked about that here. Let's talk about how leaders across industries can support integrity, transparency, and competence in a way that earns and rebuilds public trust. Maybe I'll start with you, Tashia.
Yeah, I think it comes down to coordinated relationships between professional bodies, governments, and business. For me, when you sit back and you think about trust means having high levels of competency to ensure that the individuals who are delivering services have all the right skills and competencies. It means being subject to appropriate oversight. That means having strong professional standards. And it means consistency across jurisdictions. And, it's interesting in the financial planning profession, and Pamela, as you know, I was in the accountancy profession previous to this. We think that we have all these regulatory processes in place. But in 8 of 10 provinces in Canada right now, you can call yourself a financial planner without having any credentials. There is very, very limited regulation. And we have 2 provinces. Ontario took the first step and put title protection into place. Saskatchewan and New Brunswick are following. But even then, there's challenges around harmonization. So we're putting regimes of title protection in across the country, but we're seeing slightly nuanced versions of that in these various jurisdictions. So, I applaud these governments for taking those first steps to ensure that financial professionals who are serving clients make sure that they're working in the client's best interest, have a strong ethical framework that they're bound to, have requirements to not only meet certain competency requirements, but to continue to build those competency requirements in a very changing and very volatile world, and are subject to professional oversight by a body that, puts the public interest first. And that's not always the case around the world and within Canada even. And I think that's something that we really have an opportunity to focus on is, even as we're getting these various regimes established in provinces across Canada, is there a better way to look at it? Is there a pan-Canadian way? Is there a time to take a step back? Pamela, you mentioned about the accountancy profession being regulated provincially, and there are differences in how that regulation happens, just the way that there seems to be differences in how the financial planning regulation is happening. And so how do we sort of change that narrative so that we think about this more on a pan-Canadian basis? I'm not saying federal. I'm not saying the federal government has to step in and do all of this. But, the comments that we're making to regulators today are, don't try to establish a bunch of different regimes and harmonize after the fact. Try to get that harmonization and those agreements in place right from the start, because I think that's what's going to be so important about building trust and really thinking about creating consistency across Canada. And that consistency and clarity is all for the value of the consumer.
Yeah, I'll pick up on the professional conduct piece. I think we all need to partner around sort of protecting the public, and that's, obvious, and yet, it breaks down in practice, because I think, we want to partner with employers that when somebody is, committed misconduct and is fired for cause, I want our professional conduct team to hear about it, such that they're not being foisted upon sort of the unknowing next employer and their clients. And sort of similarly, it's working with securities regulators who have, about 30% of our members use their credential for securities regulatory purposes in Canada. And, we're starting an interchange around, but it has historically been episodic. And so, are we exchanging on problematic conduct of individuals? But that only covers 30% of our membership. That's 70% of our membership that are off doing unregulated things and other types of employers, which is great. But what's the relationship like, and what's the expectation that we're going to sort of be able to protect the public from a problematic individual, should fraud or misconduct or anything else come to pass? And so, it really does have to be a partnership, and we all need to keep that public interest orientation in mind, and we all need to be dragging ourselves higher continually from an expectation, because that's where the value of a profession comes from, is sort of this integrity of boundary and self-regulation, which, I think, unfortunately, unless you continually invest, it's not going to be there.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. And stepping back, Tasha, you mentioned about the title protection now for financial planners. Globally, there is, in many jurisdictions, that accountant or audit is very protected. Tax is also protected, which it's not anywhere in Canada. And so understanding as a consumer and protecting or being in the public interest, having a consumer understand the implications of hiring someone with a professional accreditation who has to sign a code of conduct that actually means something and is utilized is incredibly important. And again, I get back to that bigger concept, like trust is what makes the financial system run. And it is so incredibly important that we ensure that the public has an understanding of what that means. And when it is fractured, how do we be very public and overt and work on rebuilding that trust? Because trust takes forever to build, and our professions respectively have done a lot of work in that vein, but it can be broken so very quickly, and then it takes much more time to build that again. So I think we need to be out there. And I think also our societies at large have benefited over the last 20 or 30 years. We have been in an unusual time of calm and certainty and stability that is only now being fractured. So I think that the public has kind of lost the plot in terms of the importance of that trust. And now that it's being fractured and it's changing and the world is becoming much more disruptive and dynamic, we're actually reverting to the mean. And we have to do a better job as professionals and professions in ensuring that the public understands the implications and the importance of that trust, which is really underpinned by that really strong ethical framework that you find within the professions.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit more about the concept of enhancing workforce agility because Canada's economy increasingly depends on a mobile and adaptable workforce. We know what the points of friction are. We know that there can be turf wars and the like. But let's talk about solutions. What enablers, such as consistent education and recognition, are essential to prepare for these emerging demands? Pamela, you go first.
Sure. So I think it's really important to have that consistent education. We have a national education program and process for the CPA designation. There's a global one that I've also participated in for the CFA as well as the FP. And then Tasha and I just announced really happily last weekend, I think enabling our professions to take advantage of one another. I see us, well, I guess we're three, I was going to say two sides of the same coin. Maybe we're three sides, but building
it's
on.
A strange coin.
Yes. Well, you never know these days. So having very complementary professions is really helpful in continuing to upskill our professionals such that they can adapt to the changing world. So having a pathway whereby FPs can take CPA Canada course materials and professional development, and likewise CPA Canada members can go out and have a pathway that accelerates their access to the FP designation, because that public, again, getting back to that public interest piece, they can then have that one-stop shop. So they get the complex tax advice that they need. They have the accounting where there's complex matters, including succession. We're having the greatest wealth transfer that's kind of ever happened. So needing all of that multitude of skills, and how can our professions better work together? And I think the recent MOU is just one example of how we're thinking about really equipping today and tomorrow's professionals to serve the public and their clients with distinction.
I'll take it in a slightly different direction and you know, sort of urge everybody in the room to engage in some of the national conversations we're having around, you know, mobility of talent, mobility sort of ties to mobility of capital, and are we making Canada the best place possible to sort of live, work, invest? You know, if we have many, many members, many of whom would be Canadians, implicitly, who are talented in New York and London and Hong Kong and other places around the world, and you know, because of this geopolitical moment we're in and some of the domestic political issues, you know, many of them are saying like maybe it's time to come home and bring the family home and, you know, find my forever place in Toronto or Vancouver or Montreal or elsewhere. And are we putting up barriers to that? Or are we bringing down barriers to that? You know, it's sort of this incentive or barrier thing. And I think many of the folks in this room and in our professions would understand what those barriers are. And we would assume that the policy folks in Ottawa do as well. They don't. You know, are we bridging? Are we bringing clarity to these conversations around tax? Are we bringing clarity to these conversations around mobility of talent and capital? Are we bringing clarity to these conversations around how to bring jobs back that for some foible in legislative quirk have gone to Ireland or Bermuda or the Cayman Islands or somewhere in the US? I mean, are we engaging in those problems, or are we seeing them and passing them by? Because the knowledge is in this room to be a solution to those problems. And so I think, you know, bridging those gaps into the policy sphere is something that I think is hugely important right now, and I think hugely relates to this mobility of talent.
Tasha, let's talk a bit about that, strengthening Canada's global position. You know, how can financial professionals, businesses, and governments work together to ensure that Canada remains a reliable and competitive financial hub on the global stage?
I think there's a few things that you have to look at. Number one is we really have to look at how we're upskilling our workforce, right? You know, particularly when you start to think about all the changes that are happening. You can't have a conversation today without somebody mentions AI, so I'm going to be that person. But it's complex and it's fast, and things are changing tremendously. And I think it's incumbent upon us as professional organizations to support the professionals to continue to upskill. And it's not just about putting in CE requirements and being sort of that, taking that regulatory lens. It's taking that supportive lens for the individuals that, who are carrying your credentials to make sure that they have access to really good, relevant, appropriate, and helpful training opportunities and the opportunity to build on the skills that we gave them at the point of certification. Pamela, going back to the discussion that you had about our MOU that we signed last week, for us, it's a great opportunity to build on the strengths of both organizations. Finance professionals need tax training, they need accounting training, but they also need training in things like investments. They need training in things like human skills, because that's going to become so much more important as we go forward. The technology is going to do a lot of the work that we traditionally have done as financial professionals, and we have to find our space in that very, very dynamic environment. And I think that's where the financial, being able to look at how do we connect with people, how do we help them understand their goals, their objectives, what are important to them, and how do we help them stay on track, right? CFP professionals prepare financial plans, but there's so much more. That can be an AI-enabled solution. But that gives a financial professional who's doing personal financial planning more opportunity to build solid relationships with their clients, really understand what matters to them, what are their goals and objectives. And on the other side, it helps them spend more time with their clients to make sure that they stay on track, that they continue to do all the things that we're telling them are appropriate. And so I always look at it as the bookends. I think, when we look at upskilling, the middle, the actual calculations and the projections and all of the things that go into a financial plan or an investment strategy or an estate plan, for example, a lot of that's going to be automated. It's those bookends that become so important, and I think that's critical as we go forward, is that we really focus on upskilling, not only in the messy middle around the AI, but also on those human skills that really define us as financial professionals. Pamela?
Yeah, I think, building on the AI conversation, there is still so much that is unknown and Wild West about AI, and it's moving so quickly, but you need to understand what underpins that technology. Is it coming with, is it source of information that it's pulling from everywhere? How do you know that's good stuff or bad stuff? And how do you tell what is good or what is bad? So if you think about what you see, is if it's being fed by Truth Social and X, is that a good source of information? We already know that AI is capable of lying deliberately, like what a lie is, a untruth done deliberately. We already know AI is capable of self-preservation. I learned about that last week. It will do things to make sure that nobody messes with it. It's almost, not quite, it's like sentient almost. So where are the professions in helping to regulate that, to understand it and to give that public confidence to what is in the mushy middle of the bookends? And that's where professions can come in. And I often say, there has never been a better time to become a CPA. There are so many opportunities growing for our profession, and I would say for the CFAs also, and the FPs also. It's not a one and done sort of thing. I think there are a lot of opportunities because of the changes that are happening and the need for that trust, that need for that oversight, consistent, comparable information that you can rely on to make decisions, because it's getting really scary out there to make decisions, and you don't want something to make decisions for you.
I would be remiss if I didn't remind all of you that the Globe and Mail is a trusted source of information. And you can read our AI policy on our website. We do have a public-facing policy. I do not use AI in my work, but you can read all about what we do because it's part of that trust conversation. Michael, I know you were already talking about kind of Canada's competitiveness on the global stage, but I'm wondering if you wanted to elaborate on those comments.
Yeah, it's been a real focus for me in the last couple of months, and I think it relates to this AI conversation. It's sort of, are we skilling ourselves up to know enough of what to take, what to leave, or are we sort of wholesale rejecting or waiting for regulation? I think becomes a very important sort of artifact on this broader conversation of, what is Canada's place in the world right now? What kind of businesses do we want to build here? How do we invest strategically to do so from an industrial policy perspective? And how do we put people to work in resilient ways? And so, we've been really focused on asset management entrepreneurship. I mean, there has been a pattern of, from a few different vectors of consolidation around the world. There's a PwC in the room that wrote a great report in 2023 citing that about half the world's assets under management are going to be effectively run by 10 firms globally. None of those firms are in Canada in any significant way. And so it becomes this question of, are we going to be sort of a collection of corporations with investment decisions about those corporations being made elsewhere? From an equity holder perspective, I think that's probably suboptimal. And where are global champions going to come from? If not, if we don't have a hand in starting them and if we aren't intentional about that. So again, are we creating the conditions for growth? Are we creating the conditions for business formation? Are we thinking about at what stage of the corporate life cycle is very geared to sort of employment versus, shareholders? Again, that's all within our wheelhouse, I think, as financial and investment professionals. But are we translating it into economic policy, and are we getting to the tables we need to be at, and intoning it in those ways that this is a problem if this continues sort of undisrupted, and if we continue to be non-intentional about our policy around this. Others are coming for us. We may not know that. That's maybe the first step in acknowledging that others are doing better than us out there in the world and attracting capital to their shores and investments to their shores, putting bums in seats that make choices about investments. And I think it's overdue that we take a more intentional stance in that way.
Okay, so we have an audience question, and I hope I'm understanding this correctly. Should compliance with the GIP standards, is that right? GIPS standards be promoted
firmly in my wheelhouse.
Okay, be promoted to the financial planner segment since their clients are the most vulnerable to fraud? Does CFP teach and promote these standards?
Yeah, so this is a really niche question, but I'll try and high level it to the best of my ability. So we have global performance standards. We administer them and are sort of the custodian of them. They came up in the U.S. One of the substantial contributors to them is in the room, actually, as well. And those were really driven by, I think, a Wild West around performance presentation for investments in the U.S., particularly in the wealth channel. And that remains the most adopted market in the world. I think in part that was due to a regulatory gap in the U.S. at the time. And so I think for the most part, our regulators have done a good job of filling in, securities regulators, the OSC and their counterparts have done a good job of filling in some of the needs there. But I think that's changing as investments change and there's more in private markets. There's more outside of the regulatory aperture than there have been in the past. And so it's probably an overdue examination of sort of, is there a need that's going unaddressed, and is there misrepresentation happening or not full representation? And those can be not exactly the same thing. Do people understand what they're paying? Do people understand what they're getting?
Yeah. Okay, we only have 5 minutes left. This conversation has just flown by. Maybe we could get a brief final thought from each of you on how Canada's financial industry can turn today's remarkable volatility into a long-term advantage by doubling down on collaboration, ethics, and competence. Never waste a crisis, they say. Maybe just, really quickly, a minute and a half from each of you on that. Pamela, you can go first.
Thanks. Well, I actually do see the Chinese curse, if that's correct. May you live in interesting times. But I also agree that there is actually more opportunity now than we've seen in probably decades because things were stable, things were known. It was quite comfortable from an economic perspective in the financial ecosystem. I think we have a real opportunity. I love the concept of the breaking down of the interprovincial barriers. Let's let things, information, people, capital flows across the country, as well as the opportunity that the federal government really seems to be taking hold of. And let's not lose sight of, we've been incredibly complacent with respect to our biggest trading partner in the United States. Let's not be complacent. Let's look elsewhere for other relationships that are important to us. Yes, the US will still incredibly, they're in the same continent, they're in the neighborhood. That continues, and we can do more. And I see a real opportunity for all of us in the coming years and decades, hopefully, for Canada to really retake that place as a strong middle power facilitator. We're the good guys. Everybody loves us. Let's double down on that and make it more true even on the capital side.
Yeah, I think that's well said, and I think a piece of what you said there, let's go out into the world and tell our story as Canada, and let's also have it be known that we're not just people that build things with shovels and hard hats and pickaxes, the mechanized versions obviously thereof. I mean, we have an incredible service economy in this. We have an incredible base of human capital in this country, an incredible ability to do things. I mean, that is not news to anybody around the world, and yet it doesn't seem to be coming from the mouths from an economic development perspective of our country, and I think that needs to change. I think that we can be a financial powerhouse in our own way. We can be an asset management powerhouse in our own way, in a way that we probably haven't aspired to in recent history, and that it absolutely can be a strategic industry for Canada and sort of a point of global leadership. And so, I would sort of impound on all of you, get to work on that. Join me. I'm pounding the pavement telling that story, but I think it's all in all of our interests to tell that story as well.
Tashia, you get the last word.
The last word. Great comments from my colleagues on the stage, and I'm not going to repeat what they've said, but I agree with them both wholeheartedly. I think for me, what I would add to the conversation is we've got a unique time right now to be able to attract talent as well. Canada is seen as an economic, in a world that is very volatile. I think Canada is seen as a bit of an economic, a little bit more stability, and that's good. We have very strong regulatory environments, which is good. We have top universities across the country, and we should be looking to make sure that we can recruit talent from around the world, bring the best talent in. Mike, to your point, we need to start thinking about how do we produce thought leadership that, to our TMU students here today, that will help you make the right policy decisions as you move out into your careers to be able to take advantage of the opportunities that we see ourselves placed with right now. And so, I can't emphasize enough the importance of education, of making sure that we do really good critical research, and that we talked earlier on about blending those partnerships, bring together industry, universities, governments together, have those conversations to make the right policy choices so that Canada can really expand its influence globally and that we can all be better off with a very strong Canadian economy.
Folks, we're going to have to leave the conversation there because we're out of time, but I really want to thank Pamela, Tashia, and Michael for their really insightful comments today and for the great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for
Thank
the great
you.
moderating.
I would also like to thank all of you, Tasha, Mike, Pam, thank you very much, and of course, Rita, for navigating that conversation. I think if I took a couple of takeaways from this, number one, trust underpins everything, and if I harken back to a recent conversation we had here with Blake Hutchison, business travels at the speed of trust, and I think you reinforced that today. Interprovincial trade and the power of a global passport, which I thought was very compelling, as well as planning with harmonization as a starting point as opposed to after the fact. My only outstanding question is, what are the provinces actually going to do? That remains to be seen. And then third, I loved, you talked about talent mobility and bringing talented, not only enabling those who are in Canada in your professions to be as strong as they can, but also enabling Canadians with those designations to come back and making that easy. And then finally, on the opportunity Now more than ever, there is an opportunity, and disruption certainly pushes us to make change, hopefully. We need to tell the Canadian story and seize on the now to attract and to retain and to develop all of our best talent. So thank you all very, very much for those messages and many more. Before we close, let me just share details of a couple of upcoming events. On Wednesday, we have a great panel talking about private equity, so all those markets that are less regulated. So please join us for that. And then on the following day, actually June 12th, we will have the Honourable Stephen Lecce, Minister of Energy and Mines. He can talk about what the provinces are going to do. So please join us, and for more information, please go to canadianclub.org. Again, I would like to thank our sponsors for today, Deloitte, EY, KPMG, PwC, and Sun Life. And as always, I would like to thank our AV supplier, VVC Live, for facilitating today's event. Thank you all for being here, and have a great afternoon.